There are men who lived loud, kings who roared, generals who marched, poets who drank and danced their names into eternity. And then there are men like Isaac Newton, men who whispered to the universe and expected it to whisper back. He did not crave applause. He barely tolerated conversation. He preferred silence, preferred shadows, preferred the long, aching hum of thought, stretching through time with no one watching. Isaac Newton changed the world in ways even he did not fully understand. He could chart the stars, explain the tides, measure light with a prism and a bit of glass. But if you were to spend a day with him, not as a student, not as a historian, but as someone who simply observed, you might be surprised, because he did not live like a man chasing greatness. He lived like a man trying to catch a thought before it disappeared. This is not a story of battles or empires. This is the quiet kind of history, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that sits in a dark room with a stack of papers and forgets to eat. And so we begin not with a discovery, but with a curtain that was never drawn. The curtains were always drawn. The morning light did not know how to enter Isaac Newton's room. It tried, of course, nudged gently through the window panes, spilled across the garden wall, stretched itself across the floorboards. But the heavy curtains stood in the way, always drawn. Always still, they hung like old thoughts too dense to move. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something older than dust, something like quiet. Newton did not wake with the sun. He woke with a question. Sometimes it came before his eyes opened. Sometimes it came in the middle of a dream that was not quite a dream. The kind of thought that floats just out of reach but leaves a mark. This morning it was something about refraction, or maybe gravity. He couldn't tell yet. He didn't speak it aloud. He rarely spoke at all, unless the thought had fully bloomed and demanded to be recorded. His bed was unremarkable, the sheets rarely smoothed. He had no habit of making them. What use was order in sleep when the waking world refused it? He sat up slowly, not out of weariness, but because rushing was for people who needed to be somewhere. Newton did not need to be anywhere. Everything he needed was already in the room. He did not pull the curtains open. He never did. Daylight could disrupt what the candlelight respected. Ideas liked the shadows, he thought. They swam better in dim corners. He moved across the floor, barefoot, one hand brushing against a shelf, too crowded to be useful. Papers stacked like leaning towers, quills sticking out of jars, old apples shriveling in bowls, forgotten under calculations. The smell was a mixture of ink, dust, and something slightly bitter. He poured water from a jug into a basin, washed his face without looking in the mirror. Mirrors weren't for men who spent most of their time trying to ignore the body in favor of the mind. Breakfast waited on a tray near the door. Bread, cheese, tea gone cold. Delivered by a housekeeper who knew not to knock. She hadn't heard his voice in 3 days. She didn't mind. He paid her well, and silence was a small price for a legend. He glanced at the tea, lifted the cup, put it down again. No hunger, no thirst, not now. The question was still with him, floating, circling, quiet. If he moved too quickly, it might vanish. And so he sat, at a desk, more paper than wood, dipped a pen, began to write, not for fame, not even for clarity, but to make the question stay a little longer. Outside, the sun tried once more to find a way in, but the curtains held. It would be hours before he noticed the day had arrived at all. Morning tea, cold and untouched, the cup still sat beside him, steamless, pale. The ring of cooled liquid clung to its rim like something waiting to be noticed. Newton hadn't touched it, not out of neglect exactly, but because the tea wasn't the point. It was never the point. The tray arrived each morning, steady as the sun he rarely acknowledged, and left each evening mostly untouched. It was a ritual performed by someone else for a man who didn't need it. But even rituals, when left alone long enough, start to speak. He looked at the cup briefly, then looked away. He had already written 4 pages since waking. Not finished thoughts, not quite beginnings either. Just fragments, words caught between stillness and momentum. He didn't write like a man telling the world. He wrote like a man trying to hold the thread of something that didn't want to be held. The tea had cooled, but the ink had dried faster. There were smudges across the margins, his own fingers, most likely. Though sometimes he wondered, when pages moved from one corner of the table to another, without memory of the moment when a pen was found uncapped on a shelf. He hadn't touched in days, when an apple vanished, but no core remained. Strange things, small things. Perhaps tricks of a tired mind, or perhaps a sign he had been thinking too deeply again. He liked that thought, that a mind could wander so far it left fingerprints on time itself. The cat appeared in the doorway, grey, quiet, uninterested. It never meowed, never scratched. It simply arrived as if summoned by the silence. Newton glanced at it, nodded once, and returned to his writing. The cat stayed exactly where it was. Both of them understood the rules. The question was still there. Not urgent, but present, like a coin beneath the floorboards. He reached for another paper, dipped the pen again, scratched a line through the previous line. Began again, then came the twist. He reached for the tea. Not with his hand, with his mind. He paused mid-sentence and stared at the cup, noticed how the liquid sat perfectly still. No ripple, no steam, just a surface. He leaned forward, breath shallow. If he stared long enough, maybe the tea would move. Not because he touched it, but because he willed it. He had read about such things, forces that moved unseen. He wondered if thought itself had weight. A drop of condensation slid down the side of the cup. Nothing more. He blinked, sat back, resumed writing. But the moment lingered, a strange one, a quiet challenge between matter and mind. He didn't speak of it. He rarely spoke of such things, but he wrote something, small, in the corner of just a phrase. What resists must first be known. The tea remained untouched, but the question had shifted, and he would spend the rest of the day chasing where it had gone. He forgot to eat. Again, the bread had stiffened by midday. The cheese, once soft, now curled slightly at the edges. A fly circled lazily over the tray, but even it seemed uncertain whether it was welcome. The tea was cold, the cup was full, and Isaac Newton had not moved from his place since morning. Not really. A stretch here, a shift there, but nothing that suggested hunger, nothing that signaled the body was winning the quiet war against the mind. He had been writing in silence, not steadily, not with rhythm, but in sudden bursts. Long pauses where he stared at the grain of the wood. Then a scribbled paragraph, a diagram drawn and immediately scratched out. He wasn't solving anything yet. He was circling, the way a hawk circles over land it already knows, but hopes to understand more deeply. The question had changed again. What began as a thought about resistance had drifted into something else, something about stillness, about why objects waited, what it meant for a thing to do nothing, until forced otherwise, the world called it inertia. Newton wasn't satisfied. His stomach gave a small noise. He ignored it. The sun had shifted in the sky. Outside, someone passed with a cart. Iron wheels clicked against stone. He didn't look up. Sound was background. People were background. The entire street could have caught fire, and he might not have known unless the smoke ruined his paper. He took 3 steps toward the far wall, then stopped. looked at a shelf, picked up a book. Didn't open it. Set it down again. Rubbed his temple with the back of his wrist. He wasn't tired, just full of motion with no place to land. He turned to the window. The curtains remained closed. He did not open them. Instead, he moved toward them and pressed his fingertips gently against the fabric. It was warm. The sun was there. But he left it covered. Then came the twist. He returned to the table and looked at the bread. Finally looked at it with the same scrutiny he gave falling objects. He picked up the crust, not to eat it, but to weigh it, not with scales, with thought. He wondered how long it would stay firm before crumbling, how many forces, seen and unseen, worked against its shape in silence. Even food, he realized, surrendered eventually to time. Even bread obeyed laws it could never question. He set it down uneaten and returned to his desk. Later, someone would find the tray untouched and shake their head. The housekeeper would whisper that he had forgotten again. But it wasn't forgetfulness. It was immersion. There are men who count their meals, and there are men who count the forces acting on a single bite of bread and never feel hunger again. Apples were not the only things falling. The tray was removed without comment. The bread gone stale. The tea still full. Newton did not look up when the door creaked open. He rarely did. The woman who tended the room had learned not to ask. Questions interrupted the gravity of the place. And gravity to Newton was not only a concept. It was a presence. It sat beside him as he wrote, pulled at him when he stood, whispered across the floorboards as if the very room was sinking slowly toward the center of something it could not escape. He sat now with a different page, a clean one. The last had become crowded with fragments. Notations in the margin. Arrows pointing nowhere. This one would be better. He needed space. Thought needed room to fall. His gaze drifted toward the corner, where an apple sat in a bowl. He didn't remember placing it there. Perhaps it had been delivered with the tray. Perhaps it had always been there. Either way, it stared at him round. Still, suspended in the silence like a dare, he reached for it, not to eat. Of course not. But to test its weight. He held it in, rolled it slightly. Let it rest in the center of his hand until the shape of it pressed lightly into the skin. It was firm, not yet bruised, a perfect subject. He rose from the chair and moved slowly to the window. Still covered. But this time he pulled the curtain back just a hand's width. A sliver of sunlight cracked across the room. Dust danced in its path. Light behaved the way it always did, predictable, straight. But the apple was heavier. The apple would fall. He opened his fingers. It dropped. Struck the floor with a quiet thud, rolled in a small arc. Came to rest near his foot. He stared at it. Then came the twist. He stepped on it, not deliberately, not carelessly either. It was a soft, inevitable motion. A slow heel press, more curious than cruel. The apple gave a muted crack under his weight. Skin ruptured. Pulp pressed into the wood. He felt it give way, not like fruit, like something older, something resigning to law. He stepped back and knelt beside it. Not to clean, to study. The break was imperfect. The wound curved. The pulp had shifted in one direction, not evenly. A slight bias. Perhaps from the floorboard's angle, perhaps from the air. The apple had not fallen in a vacuum. He dipped a finger into the pulp and smeared a line onto a scrap of paper. Then stared at it, not as food but as evidence. There was something he hadn't accounted for. He left the mess, closed the curtain, returned to the desk and began a new line of thought. Apples fell, yes, but so did thoughts. So did silence. And sometimes the bruise revealed more than the fruit ever could. Conversations with no one in particular by afternoon. The house had gone quiet again. Not that it was ever truly loud, but there were hours when footsteps passed his door, or firewood cracked in the hearth downstairs, or the cat leapt with a soft thump from one sill to another. But now there was only stillness. The sort of stillness that didn't wait for permission to enter. The kind that grew roots in the silence between breaths. Newton had stopped writing, not because he had finished, but because his thoughts had reached a strange ledge, one of those inner cliffs where reason hesitates and intuition peers over. The ink in his quill had dried. He hadn't noticed. His hand still moved slightly across the page, as if coaxing the next idea to appear like a reluctant guest. He muttered something to himself, then repeated it. No one answered. He didn't expect them to. He began talking again. Not loudly, just enough that the words, they weren't polished, they weren't even coherent, but they were necessary. Spoken like you might speak to an old friend who had become a shadow, or to a reflection that might answer back if given enough patience. Why resist? Why always resist? He asked the edge of the desk. Then to the curtain, is it gravity or stubbornness? Then to the apple bruising in the corner. Or is it both? There was a rhythm to the talking, not a conversation. A calibration. Each word nudged the thought a little further into the open. Each pause felt like a test. If the silence grew too long, he might forget what he had meant. He didn't like losing things, especially ideas. Then came the twist. He turned suddenly and said a name, Hallie, not loudly, not fondly either. But the name carried weight. He said it again, Hallie. This time with a strange expression, halfway between irritation and admiration. He was remembering a letter, a question, a challenge disguised as flattery. The sort of thing only another thinking man could send without offense. Hallie had asked him to explain something, or prove something, something to do with motion. Newton couldn't recall the details now, only the feeling it had stirred in him, that small flicker of pride and the larger wave of annoyance. He had answered the letter, eventually then buried the topic under 1,000 other pages. But now the ghost of it had returned. The name brought it back. He stood again, walking slowly to the shelf and pulling down a small book filled with loose sheets. Unnumbered, unordered, thoughts scattered like leaves that had never been pressed between pages. He flipped through them absent-mindedly, lips still moving, speaking softly to no one, to Hallie, to the apple, to the silence, and to himself. When the cat appeared again in the doorway, he glanced at it and said, as if finishing a sentence he hadn't started, "They'll all want to name it when it falls, but none of them will understand the weight." The cat blinked. Newton turned back to the desk. The conversation continued. The ink blot that became a theorem. There are moments in a thinker's life when clarity arrives not with a trumpet but with a spill. Newton had been leaning too far forward, wrist crooked, eyes narrowed, as if squinting could bend truth into shape. The quill had been dipped too deeply. The tip trembled over the parchment like a held breath. Then, without intention or grace, a thick drop of ink let go and splashed onto the center of the page. It spread like a bruise, uneven, uninvited, unwelcome. He exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in disappointment, not at the ink, at himself. The page had been promising. 3 lines of thought laid neatly beneath one another, forming something almost elegant. And now a dark blot, round and blooming, erased them in one breathless moment. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. The quill was set down. A smudge darkened the edge of his thumb. He stared at the mark for longer than most would. It wasn't just a mess. It was a moment. The ink had followed its own logic. spread itself with curves and tails, obeying no ruler, but not without law. The paper had yielded, but only so far. There were boundaries even in failure. He didn't blot it with sand, didn't try to start again. Instead, he leaned forward and traced the edges of the stain with one finger, eyes narrowing again. There was a strange beauty to it, an elegance beneath the chaos. Something about how the shape flattened, how the ink slowed at the corners. A visible hesitation. It wasn't wild, it was obedient to something. That's when the thought arrived. Not loud, not formed, but sudden. He stood and moved to the fire, where he warmed his hands for a moment without thought. Then he turned and took a different sheet from the table, blank. Not for rewriting, for exploring. He drew a rough circle, then a second, off-center. The ink from the first blot had curved not because it wanted to, but because it had to. It had been pulled. The fibers of the paper had created resistance, a kind of gravity. He began sketching again, lines and arcs, points and imaginary vectors. No names yet, no formulas, just motion, just the thought of a force that moved without being seen, but always made itself known at the moment of contact. Then came the twist. He took the original blot, the ruined page, and folded it once down the middle, not to throw it away, but to keep it. He placed it inside a book on the far shelf. Not filed, not dated, but preserved, as if the stain itself had been the messenger, not the mistake. He returned to the desk and began writing again, this time with more care. The strokes steadier. The ink flowed properly now, but the blot remained fresh in his mind. It had spoken in a language Newton understood only after it spilled. Some men find truth in equations. Others find it in the moment a mistake refuses to disappear. The cat he let in, and the door he invented, the cat did not ask to enter. It never did. It simply appeared when the hour grew still, and the house had forgotten it contained anyone at all. Newton heard the soft tap of paws before he saw it. The door to his study creaked slightly, nudged by a presence with no concept of permission. And there it was, grey, unbothered, gazing at him with that expression cats always carry, half judgment, half acceptance. Newton looked up from his papers. The page was half filled with sketches from the ink. Blot theorem, still nameless, still incomplete. He leaned back in his chair and gestured once toward the corner. The cat took the invitation without gratitude and padded over to the rug by the fire. It circled 3 times, then settled into something that resembled sleep, but was more like practiced stillness. He watched it. Not the way others watched pets, but the way a scientist watches phenomena. The curl of its spine, the rise and fall of its breath, the way its tail twitched every so often, even in rest. There was precision there, natural design, a pattern waiting to be mapped. The door swung further open behind it, nudged again by the air or the cat's earlier push. The hallway stood exposed now, lightless and long. He didn't like doors open, not because of fear, but because open doors allowed interruptions. A draft, a question, a sound from the world that assumed it had a right to intrude. He rose, not to close it, but to consider it. The door had been a problem before. Not this door exactly, but the idea of a door. Specifically, one that let animals pass without demanding someone stand by and serve it. He remembered the earlier cat, perhaps its twin. Years ago it had meowed until the wood ached. He had opened the door again and again until the repetition became unbearable. Then came the twist. He had cut a hole, a small one, near the base, enough for a cat, not large, not crude, measured, sanded, fitted with a hinged flap, and the cat had walked through it without hesitation, without thanks. just as it always did. But Newton had watched closely. He measured the force needed for the swing, the angle at which the door returned to rest. He had taken notes not to share, just to understand. He hadn't spoken of it since. The door remained forgotten, by most assumed by others to have always been there. But he remembered. It was not a gift to the cat. It was a solution to the human condition. One less interruption now. He walked to the study door, bent low, and touched the little flap at the bottom. Still intact, still functional. The cat didn't use it anymore. Perhaps it had forgotten. Perhaps it preferred the performance of arrival. Newton closed the main door gently. The cat stirred but did not wake, and the room returned to stillness, interrupted only by invention. Notes in the margins meant only for God the candle had burned low again, a crooked nub flickering defiantly, casting long shadows over his desk like the arms of invisible ghosts. Newton did not seem to notice. He was hunched forward, sleeves pushed to the elbows, head tilted just enough to make the world forget he had a spine. Around him, the desk was a quiet battlefield of parchment and forgotten crumbs. Some pages lay neatly stacked. Others were bent, wrinkled, kissed by stains that could be water, wine, or thoughtlessness. But one thing bound them all. Every sheet bore his handwriting, and in the margins something more. The main body of the work was logical, mathematical, predictable in structure, even when the content bent the laws of the known world. But the margins told another story. Short questions scribbled at odd angles, Latin phrases carved like secrets, biblical references woven in like vines curling up the spine of a cathedral. Sometimes just one word repeated 3 times. Why? Other times a note that looked like a plea or a warning. He believed God watched from the spaces others ignored, the gaps between discoveries, the silence before truth, and so he wrote there in the margins, where no one else would look, where only divinity might linger long enough. A page sat before him now, half covered in calculations that might eventually belong to optics or gravity or something unnamed. But the upper right corner had drawn his focus. He leaned close. The candlelight danced over the slope of his cheek as he scrawled something in the white space. Light knows what we cannot. He stared at the words after writing them, not reading, waiting, as if the ink might move again on its own, as if the page might offer a response. Then came the twist. He reached for a page he had written weeks earlier, folded, nearly torn at the edge. It looked more like a scrap than something worth saving. But he opened it carefully, smoothed it out, ran his hand over the words as if blessing them. In the margin, the same phrase, light knows what we cannot. He hadn't remembered writing it twice. The repetition unsettled him, not in fear, in recognition, that somewhere between the hours and the shadows, his thoughts had circled back without asking. The mind, he knew, had its own orbit. He turned to a fresh sheet and wrote the phrase a 3rd time, now deliberately, this time not for God, not for science, but as a signal, a small thread between one night and the next. He tucked the old page beneath his elbow, set the new one atop the stack, then blew gently toward the candle, watching the flame stretch thin before regathering itself. The room remained still. The margins waited, and somewhere in the quiet space between ink and breath, a question echoed without sound. Do you see me yet? The time he forgot what time was the clock on the mantel ticked, with a rhythm that had no meaning to him. Its hands moved steadily, obedient to a world of appointments and sunlight. But Isaac Newton had long stopped measuring his life that way. Time to him was not minutes or hours, but sequences of change. A candle shortening, shadows bending, ink drying between lines this morning, or what he assumed had once been morning, had dissolved quietly into something else. Perhaps afternoon, perhaps the next day entirely. He hadn't looked outside. He hadn't cared to. The room felt as if it existed outside of time, a small island suspended between thought and forgetting. He was still at his desk, knees stiff, hand smudged with soot and ink, mouth dry. He hadn't spoken aloud since the cat last left. Not that the silence bothered him, it was preferable. Words spoken aloud could be heavy. On paper, they floated. A scratch of quill, a page turned, another line tested, another corrected. Somewhere along the way he had begun recording a series of intervals, something about planetary motion, but he no longer remembered if he had meant to measure or merely observe. He flipped through the previous pages. They were all his handwriting, that much he was sure of. But the thoughts belonged to someone who had written them while floating through a version of reality. He paused, reached for the cup again. The tea was not just cold. It had begun to settle into a separation of leaf and water. The surface had dulled. Even time had begun to move inside the liquid, dividing it by weight and silence. Then came the twist. He looked at the clock, truly looked. The minute hand had not moved, or if it had returned. It pointed to the same place. It had pointed when he last looked days ago, or hours, or years. The fire had died down and risen again in that span. The candle had disappeared and returned anew, but the clock stayed, anchored, reluctant. He stood and approached it, squinting. Placed one ear, he tapped the wood, nothing. Lifted it, turned it, opened the back. The mechanism had jammed. The gears sat in silence like soldiers awaiting orders that would never come. He placed the clock back gently, looked down at his own wrist. No watch. He never wore one. He didn't need it. He returned to the desk, eyes lingering once more on the layers of parchment. He dipped the quill again, scribbled a line in the margin. Time passes even when it doesn't move. He folded that page carefully and set it aside. Not because it was finished, but because it had stopped, like the clock, like the moment somewhere. A bell rang in a sound from another world. Newton barely heard it. He was already lost in another calculation, one that didn't require a beginning or an end. Only motion letters he wrote, and never sent. They were tucked into the back of a drawer. No one opened but him, folded neatly, stacked without any clear order, some sealed, some not. A few written with such haste, the ink had run where the paper curved. Others so meticulously penned each stroke looked carved. There were no dates, no addresses, no names on the outside, just lines, curves, whispers committed to parchment. Isaac Newton wrote letters often, just not for anyone to read. He didn't write them as correspondence. There were no formal salutations, no pleasantries or signatures. These were not for friends or scholars or the Royal Society. They were not meant to win debates or settle questions. These were moments captured between the folds of his logic, emotions pressed into language by a man who rarely acknowledged having any. Sometimes he wrote to people he admired but could not speak to, not because of fear, because words spoken aloud felt brittle. On the page, they were safe. He once wrote to a man who had died 50 years earlier. Another time, to a woman whose name he remembered only because of the color of her scarf. Most often, he wrote to a version of himself he had not yet met. A man more certain, he never found him. One letter began with a single word, "Why?" The rest of the page was blank. Another ended with a sentence that still haunted him. "I will never know if I'm right." He never reread them. That wasn't their purpose. They were more exhale than record, as if his thoughts had to be let out somewhere or they would begin to calcify inside him. The drawer became a sort of graveyard, or maybe a garden. No one would ever know which. Then came the twist. One morning, after spilling ash over a fresh diagram, he reached for a cloth and opened the drawer to find it had jammed. A sliver of parchment had caught against the side. He tugged it free. It was one of the letters. The paper had yellowed. The edge crumbled slightly beneath his fingers. Curious, he unfolded it. It was addressed to God. Not in reverence, in exhaustion. He didn't remember writing it. The tone was unlike him, raw, strange. "You put the rules in place," it read, "and yet I alone am left to find them." He paused, staring at the words as though they had been written by someone else. In a way, they had. There were versions of him scattered through these pages, each one shaped by a different moment of solitude. He refolded the letter and slid it back into place. No fire would consume them. No hand would deliver them, but they would remain. Newton did not believe in waste. Every page meant something. Even silence could be measured. Even doubt deserved ink. And sometimes the most honest truths were the ones never spoken aloud, only whispered to paper and left behind. He observed dust. Like it had a soul, the beam of sunlight slipped through the narrow crack between curtain and wall, drawing a pale line across the study floor. The rest of the room remained wrapped in the dim hush of thought, but that line, sharp, golden, unwavering, became a stage, and in it the dust danced. Not wildly, not hurried, but with the patience of something eternal. Isaac Newton leaned forward, elbow on the windowsill, chin resting on one hand, and watched. He had spent the morning trying to solve a proof that refused to open. The numbers had curled into themselves like a snail resisting touch. He had turned the page twice, rewritten it once, then abandoned it altogether with the quiet sigh of a man not defeated, but delayed. And now here he was, studying the particles in a shaft of light, as if they held the missing answer. Perhaps they did. Each mote moved differently. Some floated straight until swirled by a breeze he could not feel. Others drifted in small spirals, caught in invisible eddies of warmth or air. They seemed to shimmer with intent, though he knew they were only fragments. Cloth, ash, skin, time. Even so, there was grace to them. A choreography too delicate for the eye to understand unless it truly stopped to see. He blinked slowly and whispered, "There is order, even here." He reached for his notebook without breaking his gaze. Still watching the dust, he drew a line across the page, then another, intersecting arrows. A curve, an arc that mimicked the slow fall of a single particle. Bending toward the floor. He was not certain what it meant yet, only that it mattered. He could feel it. The way a seer feels the shape of a dream before it forms. Then came the twist. A breath from the hallway stirred the air. Perhaps someone had opened a door below. Maybe the cat. It was always the cat. The dust responded instantly, not away. Not in chaos, as if summoned, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The entire beam flickered alive with the sudden current. The particles twisted, arched, retreated, then slowly returned to their gentle drift. Newton smiled. A rare, private gesture. He did not believe in accidents, not fully. Even this, dust responding to breath, was evidence of laws, gentle ones perhaps, quiet, but laws nonetheless. The universe had not overlooked the small things. It had written its code into every surface, every sigh. He turned from the window and returned to his desk, the light now falling across his shoulder. He dipped his quill again and wrote in the margin, not beside his diagram, but beneath it. All motion speaks, even what falls unseen. The dust continued to rise and descend behind him, tracing invisible lines through the afternoon air. And Isaac Newton, master of celestial patterns, sat in silence, content for now to listen to what the dust had been trying to say all along. Visitors were a distraction, and a study. He heard the knock before he saw the face. It was always 2 sharp taps, never more, never less, the kind of knock that announced not only a presence but a purpose. Newton sat motionless, quill suspended just above the paper, breath caught somewhere between patience and reluctance. He did not answer, not out of rudeness, but because he knew that hesitation worked like a filter. The unnecessary would walk away, the determined would enter. This one entered. The door opened with the sound of old hinges giving in, and a man stepped in, hat in hand, smile already prepared. Newton did not return it. He glanced only briefly at the visitor, then back at the ink that was beginning to dry in the wrong place on the page. The man began to speak, polite, eager, rehearsed. Something about admiration, curiosity, a recommendation from a friend. Newton listened without listening. What mattered was not the words, but the gaps between them. He gestured for the man to sit, not because he wished for his company, but because motion helped him observe. The way a visitor sat, how long it took them to stop adjusting their coat, whether their eyes wandered to the bookshelves or the fire. These were equations of their own. Newton catalogued them without effort. The questions began soon after. Always the same shape. What are you working on? Is it true about the apple? Can you explain the Principia in simpler terms? Newton gave short answers, clipped and factual like rocks handed across a stream. The man tried to smile again. Newton studied the smile and saw the faint twitch of impatience just below it, a flicker of teeth that revealed need, and that was what Newton disliked most, need. Then came the twist. The visitor reached for a sheet of paper on the desk. Not one of the more important ones, but still a sheet that was not his. Newton's hand moved quickly, placing a pale finger atop it before the stranger could lift it. Some things, he said quietly, are still forming. The man blinked, apologized, withdrew his hand. He looked around the room now with less warmth. Newton could see the adjustment, the shift from admiration to discomfort. The visit was nearing its end. And that was the point. Newton did not hate people. He found them useful. Observing them clarified his theories. Their words, their silences, their hunger to be understood. It all revealed the forces that moved them. He took notes in his head while they spoke, sometimes even while they left. The visitor stood, made another comment about inspiration, about brilliance, about the honor of having met him. Newton nodded once, already turning back to his desk. The door closed. The silence returned. He dipped his quill again and added a note beside his diagram of planetary motion. Not all orbits are welcome, but they leave a mark just the same. And the ink moved faster in the quiet that followed. When he spoke, it was to challenge silence. The room was quiet again, as it preferred to be. The fireplace crackled softly, and the scratching of the quill on paper had become so regular it no longer counted as sound. Newton liked it that way. Silence was a medium to think in. It stretched out like a blank sheet, ready to be written on by whatever thought might arrive. But when he did speak, which was rare, it came not as interruption, but as intrusion. Words from Newton didn't join silence. They opposed it. They sliced through it like a blade against fabric, clean and deliberate. He was alone, but that did not mean he was without an audience. Sometimes he whispered his conclusions as though someone sat beside him, someone patient and listening, someone invisible but exacting. He did not speak to be heard. He spoke to confront what had been unsaid for too long. Today the silence had grown heavy. Not empty, weighted. His thoughts had pressed so hard against the inside of his mind they needed release, if only into the dim air of the room. He set the quill down slowly, the ink barely dry on the last word, and stared at it. He exhaled. "False equilibrium," he said suddenly, staring at the page as if it had made a mistake. He stood up, walked once around the table, hands behind his back, muttering phrases not meant to be remembered. No balance without force, no rest without tension. You know this. It was unclear if he was correcting himself or scolding the air. He returned to the page and read the line aloud again. False equilibrium. This time the words sounded like a verdict. The ink stared back, silent. Then came the twist. He turned from the table and walked to the window, opening the curtain just enough to let in a blade of pale daylight. Dust stirred. He leaned forward and tapped the glass with one finger. "Even light disrupts silence," he said softly. The phrase hung there, not dramatic, not poetic, just true. He stayed at the window for a moment longer, then turned back to the room. There was no audience, no reply. But the act of speaking had shifted something. His thoughts now moved faster, as though hearing his own voice had convinced them they were real, as though naming a thing gave it permission to change. He sat back down and crossed out the sentence, rewrote it with a different curve of meaning, then another, then a third, each time saying it aloud, measuring its strength by how it struck the silence around it. He never liked noise. He never liked chatter. But silence, when too constant, became a false agreement, a lie that all was finished. And Newton never believed anything was finished. Sometimes the only way to know a thought was right was to say it out loud and let the silence flinch. He measured shadows for fun. It began with a line of light that crept across the study floor sometime between the 3rd and 4th hour after sunrise. Newton had noticed it one morning, not as something remarkable, but as something repeatable. It stretched from the corner of the curtain to the foot of his chair, always arriving with the same deliberate crawl, as if it had somewhere to be but was in no rush to get there. Most would have watched it without consequence, maybe remarked on the beauty of the angle, then gone on with their day. Newton reached for a string and a ruler. The shadow made by the edge of the curtain shifted slowly with the passing sun, bending across the planks of the wooden floor like the hand of an invisible sundial. He marked it with chalk first at dawn, then an hour later, then again and again, until a faint arc formed, a quiet register of the morning's breath. He smiled at the shape. It reminded him of a planet's path. He did not tell anyone. He measured it for himself. He dragged his chair back slightly and marked the spot where its shadow fell on the floor. He repeated this every day for a week. Each mark was slightly different. The change thrilled him. He began to measure not only the length of the shadow, but its rate of change. He jotted notes in the margins of his astronomy book, beside a page he no longer found useful. The earth moved, yes, but so did furniture, so did time, so did he. He traced the shadows made by books, by his hand, by the edge of the candlestick on the windowsill. One afternoon, he balanced a needle upright and recorded the shape of its shadow every 15 minutes, until the sun disappeared. The results made him pause. The curves were elegant, inconsistent in a way that promised explanation, not chaos complexity. Then came the twist. He stood one evening holding a candle and noticed the shadow it cast was not constant. He moved slightly and watched it stretch and bend, grow large, then suddenly vanish into the folds of the bookshelves, he whispered. Even in darkness, something tells you where you are. He spent that night sketching diagrams, lines fanning out from a single point, angles crisscrossing, like a net meant to catch motion itself. He did not need anyone to witness this. There was joy in measuring what most ignored. Outside, people marked days with bells and meals and routines. Inside this room, time was tracked by the tilt of a chair leg, the arch of a candle's glow, the slant of a forgotten book's edge. Newton was not merely searching for light, he was learning the language of what it left behind. Shadows, after all, were not absence. They were declarations, proof that something had stood there, blocking the sun, refusing to let light pass without consequence. And, to him, that was enough to measure. The mirror that gave him an idea, it had not been cleaned in weeks. The surface of the mirror was clouded by the kind of dust that softened everything, the kind that blurred truth just enough to make it tolerable. Newton had not intended to look into it. It simply caught him one morning as he passed by, the glint of dull light drawing his attention like a quiet accusation. He stopped, turned slightly, stared. The face that looked back at him was familiar, but not often visited. His own reflection was less a portrait, and more a suggestion, faintly outlined, edges melting into the gloom. He leaned closer. The mirror caught the candlelight and doubled it, flickering gently on both sides of the glass. His eyes narrowed, not at the face, but at the play of the light itself. There was something in the way the flame bent split reappeared. He moved the candle slowly, watched how the reflection followed. Not perfectly, not instantly. There was a lag, a hesitation. He moved it again, and there it was. It wasn't the mirror's fault. It was doing what mirrors do, reflecting. But in the way it responded to motion, something shifted in him. The glass became more than a surface. It became a participant. He turned away and retrieved a small lens from his desk. Then a second, held one in front of the other. He took a black cloth and covered the mirror, as if closing a book. Then he sat and began to sketch, not what he had seen, but what he had not seen. What he suspected the mirror had tried to do but failed because it was too old or too simple. He drew a curved surface, then another. Imagined not one point of reflection, but many. A glass that did not bounce light evenly, but gathered it, focused it, held it still. He called it a concept, but it felt like a memory. The idea of a reflecting telescope had been dancing at the edges of his thoughts for weeks. Not fully formed, just hinted at. Now, with a mirror and a flame, it had come to rest. He did not speak, he did not smile. He simply set to work. His hands moved with certainty as he began to diagram the instrument, calculating distances, angling reflections, predicting the behavior of light as though it were a guest he knew too well to surprise. Outside, the world prepared for another afternoon. The streets stirred. A bell rang somewhere in the square. But inside, Newton sat beside a covered mirror, inventing something that would allow men to see what their eyes never could. It was not vanity that had shown him this. It was the quiet truth that sometimes even your own reflection can be more than an image. Sometimes it is a doorway, and on the other side of that glass, an idea waits. Lunch was a concept, not a meal by midday. The sun had shifted far enough to cast new shapes across the table, and the air inside the study had grown still and warm. Somewhere in the house, a servant had likely passed by, wondering whether to knock, whether to ask if he needed food. But there was no plate, no cup, only parchment and instruments, diagrams half-sketched, and ideas still dripping from the edge of his mind. He did not eat because it was noon. He ate when his body refused to let him continue without protest. Most days, it never quite got that far. Hunger was like a conversation he could postpone, a voice that mumbled under the roar of celestial thought. When the mind was full, the stomach could wait. He had once placed a piece of bread beside his desk, and returned hours later to find it hard as stone, still untouched. Now part of the furniture, he had frowned at it like it had betrayed him, as if the bread should have reminded him, or waited better. Sometimes he would walk into the kitchen, turn in a slow circle, and leave again without lifting a spoon. The act of needing to chew, to pause, to ground himself, it all felt inconvenient. Food required steps, attention. And there were moments when attention was the rarest currency he possessed. Then came the twist. One day he reached for what he thought was a boiled egg. His hand closed around it absently as he stared at a page full of equations. He adjusted the candle, shifted the paper, then pressed the egg lightly against the edge of the table. The shell did not crack. The surface gave slightly, like old parchment. He looked down. It was not an egg, it was a polished rock. He stared at it, unmoving, trying to remember how it had come to rest beside his calculations. He could not. Perhaps he had placed it there to weigh down papers, or to observe the shape of shadows. But in that moment he had tried to eat it. He set it down and blinked. The realization did not embarrass him. It fascinated him that the brain, when full of stars and light and invisible force, could forget the simple difference between nourishment and granite. He jotted a note, not about the rock, but about how easily the senses surrendered to thought. He would eat later, perhaps fruit or broth, or nothing. The need would return eventually, but for now he was content to exist as thinking matter, unanchored by flesh. Lunch was not a moment to him. It was a theory, one he tested occasionally, but never relied upon. The rock remained on the table for days, a quiet reminder that even the greatest minds must eventually look down. But not yet, not today. Today, there was still too much to understand. His hair was wild, but not by accident. It never lay flat, not even in sleep. The strands moved as though they had ideas of their own, lifting slightly with every motion, falling back into stubborn act. Newton's hair had become something of a mystery to those who saw him in passing. Was it forgetfulness? A symptom of his genius? Or simply the weather playing tricks on an unkempt mind? The truth, like most things in Newton's life, was far more intentional. He had once stood before a mirror with a brush in one hand and a theory in the other. The brush lost, not because he was unaware of his appearance, but because appearance was a language, and Newton spoke it with precision. The unruly hair told people what he didn't want to waste time explaining, that he was occupied, that conversation would be tolerated but not welcomed, that the workings of gravity and light held more weight than polish or style. Visitors often assumed he had rolled out of bed that way. They didn't realize he spent just enough time ensuring that every strand communicated exactly what it needed to. Chaos suggested brilliance. Disorder suggested depth. The truth was not that he didn't care. It was that he cared differently. On days when he expected no one, his hair was even wilder. Not because he had no audience, but because he was free to let it mirror the tangle inside his mind. Ideas rarely arrived in straight lines. Why should his appearance pretend otherwise? Then came the twist. One morning, while adjusting the small mirror near the window, he noticed a patch of his scalp that had begun to thin. The hair there bent differently, light slipping through it with more ease than before. He froze for a moment, not in vanity, but in curiosity. He leaned closer, tilted his head, studied the angles. In that thinning circle, he traced time, not in hours or years, but in thoughts. How many pages had he written since that patch had darkened the mirror less? How many nights without sleep? How many meals skipped, debates endured, hypotheses failed? He did not sigh, he did not speak. He simply nodded once, as if the loss of hair was just another variable in the experiment of living. Another sign that his mind had burned brighter than his body could contain. That day he left the house without brushing it at all. The strands rose in strange formations, whispering equations to one another with each shift of the breeze. People stared, as they always did. But Newton didn't notice. Or if he did, he let them wonder. Because the wildness was not neglect, it was truth. Truth worn quietly, rebelliously, against a world that prized symmetry over substance. And in the storm of his thoughts, his hair rose like a signal, not of madness, but of a man too full of answers to be tamed. Theology between calculations, the margins of his notes told more than the theorems. Between sketches of prisms and fragments of planetary motion, one could find single lines of scripture, questions aimed not at fellow scholars, but at the divine. He had a habit of drifting from formulas into fragments of revelation, as if one realm leaked into the other without apology. To Newton, mathematics was not separate from God. It was, in fact, God's handwriting, written in angles, in gravity, in light itself. He did not pray with clasped hands or bowed head. He prayed by calculating. Every solved equation felt like an answered question. Every mystery pointed upward. When he examined how one body pulled another across the darkness, he did not think only of mass or force. He thought of design, of the mind behind the rule, of a being not distant, but deliberate. Visitors who expected to find only science in his, they would ask about motion, and he would quote Job. They would mention velocity, and he would reply with psalms, not to impress, but because the line was thin. For him there was no sharp border between reason and reverence. Then came the twist. On a morning, while reviewing a series of equations on celestial mechanics, he paused on a line he had rewritten 3 times. The numbers resolved perfectly, yet something in him refused to move on. He stared, then slowly wrote beneath it, "But who sustains it when I am asleep?" He sat back. That question wasn't mathematical. It wasn't even philosophical. It was intimate. A moment of wonder breaking through the routine of logic. There had been nights when he studied too long, until the world outside had curled into silence, and even the candle seemed tired. He would pause, not from exhaustion, but from awe. How could everything work so precisely, even when no one watched? When all minds rested and all pens lay still, the planets continued their orbits, the tides obeyed their unseen call, and light kept traveling through voids, too vast for imagination. He did not call this faith. He called it alignment. The belief that truth, wherever found, pointed home, whether it came through scripture or spectrum, through numbers or names, the source remained the same. Some criticized him for spending more time on theology than physics. They did not understand that he saw no difference. To speak of gravity without speaking of its creator felt like explaining a painting without acknowledging the brush. He returned to his diagram and kept writing, but the line he had added stayed at the bottom of the page, untouched. A quiet reminder that even in the exactness of science, there lived a longing for something beyond precision. And Newton, in his solitude, held both compass and conviction. Not in conflict, but in conflict, but in conversation, because between every calculation, the moment he forgot the world existed, the candle had burned itself into a stub, its light no longer steady, but flickering like a heartbeat losing rhythm. The shadows it cast were taller than they should have been, stretching across books, crawling up the walls, bending around the curve of his hunched shoulders. Newton sat unmoved. The quill was still in his hand, though his fingers had gone slack. The ink had long since dried on the tip, but he hadn't noticed. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on a single line of figures that had long ago slipped from meaning into trance. He had been writing about curvature, about the way objects fall, not just through space, but through the shape of space. He had diagrammed circles inside ellipses, then drawn arrows through them like stitching, somewhere between the 5th correction and the 6th reconsideration. His awareness loosened its grip on the room. The ticking of the small clock near the window disappeared. The chair beneath him, the pages stacked beside him, the ache in his back, all gone. The world collapsed gently, not violently. It folded in on itself like parchment curling near fire, and in its place there was only movement, only the perfect alignment of numbers sliding into place, of thoughts no longer being chased, but finally arriving. It was not joy. It was not satisfaction. It was stillness, complete and without condition. Then came the twist. A bird struck the window. Not hard, just enough to startle the silence. The thud echoed like thunder across the surface of the moment. Newton blinked. His hand twitched. He looked down and realized the candle was gone. Just a smoking wick now, forgotten in its effort. He exhaled, long and slow, and realized he had not done so in a while. The return to the room was not abrupt. It was strange. The angles seemed wrong. The light had changed. He could not tell if it was morning or afternoon or some space between. He glanced at his hands. They felt both familiar and borrowed. The paper in front of him was filled with lines and numbers. His handwriting was unmistakable, but the logic of the page was too fluid, too unbroken, too complete. He stared at it and felt the first shiver of awe, not because he had written something brilliant, but because for a moment he had not been the one writing. There were days when he wondered if the mind could leave the body and return unchanged. This was one of those days. He sat back, wiped the ink from his fingers, and looked out the window at the sky beyond the glass. He had no name for what had happened, no formula, no theorem, just a sense that something immense had visited, then vanished. And as the bird flew off again, leaving no trace but a faint smear of feather on the glass, Newton whispered, "It almost made sense." He doubted more than he believed. The more he understood, the less he trusted what he knew. Newton's study was lined with books he rarely opened twice, not because they lacked value, but because each answer inside them seemed to close a door rather than open one. His notebooks overflowed with revisions, lines crossed out in sudden violence, equations restructured not for elegance, but for the uncomfortable suspicion that the original had been too neat. Perfection felt dishonest to him. If something fit too easily, it probably hadn't been examined hard enough. He did not speak this aloud. Doubt was not weakness in his eyes, but a form of discipline. It meant you cared enough to keep turning the thought over until it showed you its other side. He distrusted certainty, especially in himself. On days when others praised his theories, he would quietly begin dismantling them, not to prove anyone wrong, but to see how far they could stretch before snapping. Even gravity, the very thing his name would be tied to for centuries, he approached with suspicion. He did not think of it as a law, but as a question disguised as a pattern. That objects fell did not prove why they did. Attraction was not an explanation. He wanted to know what caused it. Then came the twist. He once spent an entire day reworking a diagram he had already published. The shape of an orbit had seemed too symmetrical, too cooperative. He removed a single variable and everything unraveled. The ellipse fell apart. The prediction failed. For hours he sat watching the pieces of his theory refuse to return to form. The math had obeyed him before. Now it mocked him. He took a walk in the garden, the pages still fluttering on the desk behind him. The wind tugged at his coat, and the sky above looked too wide, too empty. He stared upward and whispered a thought not even the pages had earned. What if I'm only guessing well? There was no answer. Not from the wind, not from the sky. He did not believe everything he wrote. He trusted the process, not the conclusion. To believe too easily would have been a kind of laziness. To doubt was to stay awake. Visitors assumed he was driven by ambition. Some imagined him desperate to explain the universe. But the truth was quieter. He simply could not rest in half. Knowing, he turned every truth around in his hands until it splintered, and then he studied the splinters. Doubt was not the shadow of belief for him. It was the soil from which better questions grew. At night, when the house stilled and the world exhaled, he would reread his own writing and whisper, "Not yet." That was his prayer, his protection, his refusal to be lulled into satisfaction. And in that refusal, he found his sharpest clarity, because Newton believed in questions more than he ever believed in his own answers. The law of motion on his bedroom floor. The floorboards creaked with a familiarity that made them part of his thinking process. Each groan of the wood beneath his feet marked the pacing rhythm of ideas in motion. He did his clearest thinking, not at the desk, but in the narrow space between the bed and the opposite wall. There, Newton walked in lines and loops, retracing thoughts with every step. The boards remembered his weight. The air grew heavy with repetition, and somewhere between the first turn and the 30th, the seeds of a law began to press against his mind. He had rolled a small ball across the room, not as an experiment, but as a distraction, something to fill the moment between two unsatisfying conclusions. It moved lazily, bounced off the wall, and returned to rest near the leg of a chair. He watched it, then kicked it gently. Again it rolled. Again it stopped. He frowned. It should have kept going. Something had stopped it, the floor perhaps, or the resistance in the air, or something else entirely. The question clung to him. Why did it stop? And more curiously, under what conditions would it never stop? Then came the twist. He knelt down and cleared a path along the floor, using smooth paper from a drawer. Carefully, deliberately, he rolled the ball again. It moved farther this time, slower in its decline. He measured its distance, marked its path with chalk, and noted the imperfections in the surface that interrupted its motion. In that quiet room, slippers still beside the bed and his coat draped over a chair, Newton began to sketch the principles that would later astonish the world. Objects stayed in motion unless something interfered. An interruption was not the default. Stillness was not natural, it was caused. He wrote on the floor before writing on the page. Simple statements that hardened into law. Not because they were beautiful, but because they refused to break under pressure. His theories had not arrived in a grand laboratory. They had grown from the silence of worn planks and the arc of a wooden ball nudged by a restless mind. The sun had set by the time he sat back on the floor, legs stretched out, chalk dust on his fingers. He stared at the wall the ball had struck and whispered, "Equal and opposite." The phrase felt right, not dramatic, just true. He repeated it once more, softly, as though afraid to break the spell of discovery. He eventually slept with notes on the floor beside him, and one shoe still unlaced. The ball rested near the corner, motionless now, but still part of the equation. That night, he dreamed not of planets or stars, but of endless corridors where things rolled forever, unbothered, free. And somewhere in the dark, his law waited patiently to be named, not born in thunder, but traced in dust across the floor of a man too curious to stop moving. He saw time as something you could fold to most people. Time passed. To Newton, it bent, it coiled, it stretched like warm wax. He didn't see it as a line you moved along, but as a shape you could examine from different angles. Time for him wasn't a river, it was a map, and if you understood the laws well enough, you could fold that map, crease it where it once seemed smooth, and bring two distant points together without ever leaving your chair. He once spent an entire evening staring at the flame of a single candle. He didn't move. He barely blinked. The candle, unaware of the attention, simply burned. But Newton wasn't watching the fire. He was watching the length of the wick, the shrinking of the wax, the shift of the light as the air around it warmed. Time had a scent in that moment, melted tallow and slow inevitability. Someone passing might have thought he was praying. In a way, he was. He was asking time to reveal itself not as a master, but as a mechanism. He wanted to know how it moved when no one looked, whether it flowed in silence or ticked invisibly like some distant machine behind the stars. Then came the twist. He folded a piece of parchment in half and drew a dot on each side. "This is one moment," he whispered, "and this is another." He brought the dots together. The page crackled. The idea didn't. It stayed in his hands, humming like something almost alive. He looked around the room and wondered what parts of it were older than they appeared. The chipped cup on the table, the dust in the corner. The book left open to a page he hadn't read in years. He had never considered them objects. They were time anchors, places where memory had come to rest. He stopped measuring hours with clocks and began measuring them with change. When the shadows shifted, when the light curved through the window at a different angle than the day before, when the silence in the room felt heavier, that's when he knew time had moved. He began writing about it, not as a sequence, but as a structure. He didn't claim it could be reversed, but he wasn't sure it couldn't be. There were days when he sat so still, thinking so deeply, that he forgot whether it was morning or dusk, and when he returned to himself, the line of time had snapped. He once lost an entire afternoon imagining what would happen if you could slow 1 second into 1,000. What might be seen in the space between ticks, what might exist in the pause time, to Newton, was not a prison. It was a question. One he never stopped folding, and as he looked at the creased paper in his hand, he wondered, not if he could escape time, but if he already had without realizing it. The night was his favorite time to begin the house, made different sounds after sunset. The floorboards didn't complain as loudly. The air settled into itself. Even the ink felt darker, smoother, more obedient. Daytime belonged to noise, footsteps, knocks, deliveries, distractions. But night bowed to thought. It was in those hours, when the sky went quiet and the world forgot itself, that Newton truly began. He would not light the candle immediately. He liked to sit in the soft half, darkness, waiting for his eyes to adjust, waiting for the silence to settle in properly. The room took shape slowly. The familiar corners, the curve of his chair, the outlines of paper stacks became visible in layers. This was not delay, it was ritual. It reminded him that seeing was not instant, neither was understanding. He moved slower at night, but thought faster. The ideas came like whispers, not storms. Gentle, persistent thoughts that tiptoed in through cracks in the ceiling or swirled up from the wooden floor. Equations that made no sense at noon unfolded effortlessly by starlight. Concepts that resisted definition surrendered under the watch of a flickering flame. Then came the twist. Yon night, as he prepared to resume work on a particularly troubling calculation about planetary motion, he paused before lighting the candle. Something in him resisted the match. The dark felt heavy but not hostile. He sat down anyway, pencil in hand, page ready, and wrote. He could not see the lines, not clearly, but his hand moved with quiet certainty, like it had memorized the paths the mind had taken. He scribbled curves and corrections by instinct, trusting something older than vision. When he finally struck the match and illuminated the paper, the diagram was there, crooked, smudged, strange, but right. He hadn't needed light, he'd needed less of the world. He began doing this more often, writing in near, dark, listening more than thinking, letting the absence of sight become a kind of focus. Night became a collaborator, not just a backdrop. It did not rush him. It asked nothing of him. It made no sound when he sighed. It simply received. Sometimes the birds would begin their songs before he realized the sky had changed. That was his cue. Not to stop thinking, but to rest the body that carried the mind. People believed Newton burned the midnight oil because he was obsessed. The truth was simpler. The day belonged to interruptions. The night belonged to wonder. He once said softly to no one, "Daylight reveals what's obvious. Night reveals what's true." He never raced the morning. He welcomed it. But only after he had wrung every secret he could from the silence. And as the candle guttered and his head finally lowered to the desk, his notes still open and unsorted. Newton didn't dream. He had already done that wide awake, in the dark, with the stars as his witness. He never finished anything, but changed everything. There were always scraps, half-solved equations on crumpled paper, diagrams missing their labels, letters never sealed, books with pages dog-eared not from use but from abandonment. Newton's desk was a museum of nearlies, a universe of almosts. He left trails, not destinations. And yet somehow, in all that incompletion, he redrew the map of understanding for everyone who came after him. He didn't aim for neatness. He aimed for pursuit, for the chase of an idea just barely out of reach. He would begin one theory, then interrupt himself with a footnote that became a whole other field of study. He'd try to polish a conclusion, only to find it crumbling under a better question. What looked like procrastination from the outside was really something else. Movement. Constant, unrelenting movement toward something bigger than a final answer. There was no final answer. That was the problem, or perhaps the gift. Then came the twist. He once revisited a box of his old writings. Notes he hadn't touched in over 10 years. The handwriting was younger, the tone bolder. Equations he'd once believed in now seemed childish to him. He began correcting them, then stopped. His pencil hovered. He smiled, barely. Not because they were wrong, but because they had once been right enough to take him somewhere better. He closed the box, left the papers inside untouched. Not from pride, from reverence. Those unfinished thoughts had been ladders, and you don't criticize a ladder because it ends before the sky does. People waited for him to publish his great work, to give them a finished gleaming theory. Instead, he gave fragments. Brilliant, dense, tangled fragments. But in those fragments were the bones of entire disciplines. Physics, optics, calculus. He planted forests and moved on before the trees grew tall. He never declared anything perfect. He rarely even declared anything complete. His notebooks trailed off mid-sentence, as if the thought had run ahead and he was still catching up. He didn't fear the gaps. He lived in them. The white space between ideas was where his mind breathed best. Sometimes, late at night, he would reread something he wrote and whisper, "That can't be all." Not dismissively. Hopefully, the work was always a beginning, never a monument. Newton didn't change the world by finishing things. He changed it by refusing to pretend he ever could. He left the door open always, a foot wedged against it, a candle just lit, a sentence waiting for its second half. And in that unfinished room, generation after generation has walked in, picked up the pens, not because he told them what to think, but because he showed them how to wonder. So what did Isaac Newton do all day? He sat with questions and got comfortable with silence. He watched light scatter across the same floorboards for decades and still found something new in the way it bent. He began projects with the intensity of fire and abandoned them with the calm of someone who knew the spark had already done its work. He doubted deliberately. He observed endlessly. He scribbled truths onto scraps and left them behind, like breadcrumbs for the future. He was not polished, not orderly. He did not wake with a list or sleep with closure. He was a man stitched together with interruptions, of thought, of faith, of rest. And yet, in all that disorder, he carved the path modern science still walks. The apple was not the story. The gravity was. The silence after it fell. The thoughts that came in the wake of ordinary things doing ordinary things and revealing extraordinary rules. Newton's genius wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with trumpets or end in triumph. It moved like light through a prism, quiet, relentless, breaking things open. He showed us that the world is made of laws, but also of wonder, that logic does not kill mystery. It invites it deeper in. So as you drift into sleep, know this. The man who saw invisible forces, who measured time with shadows, and believed silence could answer questions, he never sought fame, only understanding. And in his quiet corner of the world, he taught us how to look up, to pause, to ask, what holds it all together? Maybe it's God, maybe it's something we haven't named yet. But tonight, like Newton, you don't need to finish the thought. You just need to follow it.